Good. Well, welcome everyone. Good morning, and welcome to ECI's Leading Edge series on the convergence of ethics and compliance in ESG. As Alyssa said, my name is Dan Waltman. I'm the Vice President of Member Engagement at ECI. And we are very delighted to have you all here today and tomorrow for this exciting and engaging program around the rapidly evolving topic of ESG and the impact it is having on the ethics and compliance profession. Before we get started in today's program, I would like to thank our sponsors both for their generous support and contributions to make this program possible. Our sponsors are the Center for Audit Quality, CohnReznick, Ethico, and OneTrust. I also wanted to remind you to please keep your microphones on mute during the sessions and to use the chat function to submit questions to the speakers. Without any further ado, I'd like to move us on to today's first session, Launching Your ESG Program, sponsored by CohnReznick and moderated by Maurice Crescenzi, who also serves as the Risk Advisory Practice Leader at CohnReznick. Maurice, welcome and over to you.
Thank you, Dan, and good morning, everyone. Nice to be with you. We have a presentation that we will step through, so if my colleague Ben wouldn't mind launching that, and hopefully you can all see it. So welcome to our session on launching your ESG program. We intend in the next 50 or 60 minutes to step through some fundamental ideas associated with how best to get your ESG program off the ground, and all the while throughout the session hitting on what we see as the interconnection and interrelationship between an organization's ESG program and its ethics and compliance program, and moreover, even its enterprise risk management program. So we're going to bear all of that overlap in mind as we go along here. Ben, if you wouldn't mind advancing to the next slide. So just by way of introduction, and just to be clear, Ben and I will be co-presenting this session together. So again, Maurice Crescenzi, great to be with all of you. It's always great to be back with the ECI. I go back a few decades with the ECI. It's always a real pleasure and a treat to participate in these kinds of events, especially on some of these cutting edge topics. So I lead CohnReznick's risk advisory practice. We are a Big 10 or Big 12 professional services firm. The risk advisory practice is composed of all of our Sarbanes-Oxley services, internal audit services, enterprise risk management capabilities, ethics and compliance services, and our ESG capabilities. All of that is within the risk advisory practice. I have over 30 years of experience. I spent the first 20 years in industry, I guess, on, for most of you, I guess on your guys' side of the webcam. I worked for quite a long time in the consumer products industry, mainly for the Philip Morris family of companies, later known as the Altria family of companies. I'm a former chief compliance officer. I have reported into the audit committee of the board in a previous life, and I've been directly responsible for designing and implementing my company's ethics and compliance programs. From a practitioner perspective, I made the move to the consulting side 10 or 11 years ago into the Big Four, and I've been serving clients ever since. With respect to ethics and compliance services, but also with respect to enterprise risk management services and ESG. So hopefully you will see as we go through this that we bring a unique perspective on this quickly converging idea of the overlap of ethics and compliance issues and risks, and the programs that should be designed to manage those issues and risks. So we'll be stepping through all of that. I also teach at the graduate level in New Jersey. I teach the required business ethics course at Rutgers in the MBA program, and I teach a couple of graduate level courses at Montclair State University for the Masters of Law and Governance. So I'll kick it over to Ben for a brief intro, and then we'll dive in. Ben?
Hey everyone, how are you today? Ben McGovern. I'm a senior manager here at CohnReznick, and I'm supporting the ESG practice. I specialize really in regulatory risk, compliance and ethics, and quality. I got my start in consulting in life sciences, as well as prior to that life, I was an environmental engineer focusing on real estate and land development, as well as chemicals and industrial manufacturing. Really excited today to talk to you about our ESG our practice and programmatic implementation.
Great. Thank you, Ben. Next slide, please, if you don't mind. Okay, so we'll step through. I mean, I guess the learning objectives and the key takeaways are essentially, especially for organizations just getting started on the ESG journey, or just beginning to think about the overlap of ethics and compliance with ESG, we thought these topics would be germane. So taking a closer look at some of the common environmental, social, and governance issues, taking a look at the frameworks, the programmatic frameworks that organizations can design and leverage internally to actually manage those risks and those issues, and simultaneously optimizing and maximizing their competitive advantage on those very same risks and issues. We see E and S and G issues as both risks that need to be managed in order to achieve your strategic objectives, but also as opportunities to maximize your competitive advantage in the marketplace if those issues are treated properly. And then, an important thing to talk about when you're thinking about the convergence of ethics and compliance and ESG is how to get started. We hear time and again from many of our clients the following problem statement, which is, we know ESG is important, but we just don't know what to do about it or how to get started or what it means to us. So that this idea of getting oriented around what ESG means to each organization is a fundamental first step in setting out on that journey. And then we'll talk a little bit about one of the phases of the ESG lifecycle, which is the reporting and data governance piece. And we'll talk about how that phase fits into the overall ESG lifecycle journey as we go through this, and then we'll wrap up with some key takeaways and then wrap up. Okay, so if we could progress, please, Ben. So, Ben and I are both really excited to talk about this today. This idea of the convergence of ethics and compliance, candidly, is something that I've been thinking about probably for 2 decades, long before the moniker of ESG came on the scene, maybe 5 or 7 years ago. I think we would, for those of us who've been in the space for a while, we would probably agree that ESG, as it's understood today, has had like precursor or predicate concepts that have been out now for a few decades, going back to the late 90s and early 2000s, when we think about the big bang of ethics and compliance with the collapse of Enron and Arthur Andersen and some of the other more infamous scandals around WorldCom and Tyco. All around that same time, stakeholders were beginning to push for greater transparency and corporate accountability, not just from a financial bottom line perspective and transparency perspective, but also on the environmental footprint issues and the social issues as well. And that kind of gave rise to this sort of new phenomenon back then around issues management, which was a precursor to ERM and corporate social responsibility. And many organizations, particularly Fortune 500, began to really focus on CSR and triple bottom line reporting, financial, environmental, social, bottom line reporting, and in line with the GRI guidelines and all of that. So it's safe to say that ESG, while it's a relatively new and hot sort of topic in the last handful of years, has an ancestor or two that we've been familiar with now for a while. And I've been, for a couple of decades, thinking about the relationship between CSR issues and ethics and compliance issues, right? Particularly if you think about it from the point of view of some of the more progressive chief compliance officers and chief ethics officers who over the decades have taken a broader view of an organization's ethics and compliance risk profile, right? If you think about in the Fortune 500 category, the average company's code of conduct and what the table of contents covers, it's probably 30 or 40 or 50 topics that really run the gamut across social issues, environmental issues, and governance issues, right? Like that table of contents to me reflects the organization's ethics and compliance risk profile. It's not just conflicts of interest, it's not just fraud, it's not just bribery and corruption, it's really like everything. And so when you think about that, and then you think about an organization's corporate social responsibility profile, you see a lot of those same topics. A lot of those very same companies are, have been reporting on those same issues through their sustainability reports or CSR reports for decades. And now we're at a point where it's referred to as ESG, and there's certainly, a call for even more transparency and more data and more KPIs and more metrics. But these basic concepts have been around for a while. So when you think about ESG, I mean, one of the first things that I would call out is we don't think of ESG as a singular issue or a singular risk. We've seen some clients that would put ESG as a bullet point on a heat map of one of many risks to think about and to work through. We like to think of ESG as an umbrella concept out of the gate, just to sort of set the table. And then it's under E and under S and under G are really the sub-issues that apply to your organization based on your industry, your business model, your operating model, your geographic footprint, who your stakeholders are, and all of that kind of stuff will drive what your E and S and G profile actually is. This slide just gives a couple of illustrative examples under E and S and G of some of the sub-issues that are commonly recurring across many organizations. Some of these issues apply everywhere, right? There's a universal transcendent kind of push for DEI, right? A couple of years back, we think about the social unrest in the US and elsewhere in the world, and helping to kind of create that platform, that burning platform for more accountability in the areas of diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. That's a topic that cuts across industries and geographies. Other topics like maybe carbon footprint or water usage would be more dependent on the actual type of business that you're in. That would be big for manufacturing and maybe not as big for other types of organizations. So that's some of a few of the takeaways on this table setting slide, is to think of ESG not as a singular issue, but more as an umbrella concept under which there is what we think of as an E and S and G issues profile. And in terms of the convergence with ethics and compliance, those sub-issues are many of the same, if not all of the same, ethics and compliance issues that chief ethics and compliance officers strive to manage in their organizations, as reflected in many examples in the organization's table of contents and their code of conduct. So that's probably good for this slide. Ben, if you don't mind going to the next slide. I just, as a reminder, I'm going to try to save the questions to the end, but keep them coming in. I just happened to glance at one question just now around whether a particular issue should be classified as a social issue or a governance issue. Just like with enterprise risk management and just like with ethics and compliance risk assessments, this stuff is as much of a science as it is an art. And there's no sort of one answer for a question like that. A lot of it to me depends on the organization's organizational chart, its business model, its operating model, where particular expertise resides within an organization, We have clients that classify cybersecurity as a governance issue. We have clients that classify it as a social issue. To me, it doesn't matter, all things being equal, as long as it's captured somewhere on the E and S and G profile, as long as it's there, it doesn't matter to me so much whether it's under S or under G. I think the answer really depends on what makes the most sense for a given organization, again, based on organizational charts and where the expertise lies to manage those risks. And, you know, from the organization's perspective, is it recognized as a governance type of an issue, like conflicts of interest might be, or you know, other kinds of compliance risks? So ESG, again, one of the opening points I made is that we think of the sub-issues under E and under S and under G as both risks that the organization needs to manage, and you would probably say the same thing if you were talking about those same issues from an ethics and compliance perspective, and even from an enterprise risk management perspective. These are risks that the organization needs to manage. Many of these risks are grounded in regulatory requirements that, if there's a lack of compliance with, would result in civil or criminal fines or penalties, certainly reputational brand damage. So many, if not all of these issues have underneath them regulatory requirements that obligate compliance, and, you know, a lack of compliance would result in certain consequences. At the same time, many, if not all of those very same issues have an upside, right? There's an opportunity, if the organization is managing those issues effectively and optimizing their performance internally and in the marketplace, to differentiate themselves from their competitors. And more we're seeing third parties requesting information around what companies are doing with respect to certain ESG issues, as a way of, in the context of procurement or in the bidding process. So there's absolutely an upside in the marketplace to get these issues right, and to think about each one of these as a two-sided coin, if you will, with risk on the one side and opportunity on the other side of the coin. And there are a number of what we think of as drivers that are that are coalescing and you know, compelling forward the push around ESG, right? The evolving regulatory landscape, the push around climate and sustainability, and these are issues that many organizations are thinking about in the context of ESG these days. The global economy and cross-border distribution, supply chains upstream and downstream, right? The company's brand and public image in the marketplace. These are all aspects of ESG. And let me take this as an opportunity just to take that same step back a little bit. I remember years ago when I first got into the ethics and compliance space. Again, this is 2 decades ago, a little more than 2 decades ago now. And when, you know, many companies were still trying to figure out what ethics and compliance was, right? And what the federal sentencing guidelines intended, and how to leverage the federal sentencing guidelines in designing the internal company's compliance program, and what the DOJ back then would be expecting long before they published their guidance. And I heard a chief compliance officer at one point in a conference, maybe 22 years ago, say something like, ethics and compliance is really everything. It's everything an organization does. It touches all aspects of any company's operations across finance and HR and quality and R&D and marketing and on and on. And the same was being said back then about CSR. And I think the same should be said now about ESG. I mean, it really is everything that an organization does. That there's some aspect in all aspects of the organization's operations that has an E or an S or a G component to it. And I'll also take this opportunity to say, I think it's safe to say that in most, if not all organizations, you're already doing ESG, whether it's referred to as ESG or not, whether it's an organized ESG effort or not. You know, if you're in manufacturing, I'm willing to bet that you've got an internal environmental compliance program, maybe predicated on the ISO standard, that is very much in line with ESG mandates and ESG expectations, right? If you've got a push around DEI, or you have a buttoned up cyber program, you know, you're already doing sort of the underpinning work of ESG, even if it's not pulled together yet, or you're not reporting out on it, you're doing a lot of that ESG related work already. So I think that's another important thing to say. Okay, Ben, let's, if you don't mind, let's go to the next slide, please. So I guess, you know, further to that point around this idea that ESG is really everything, and I do believe that it is. I think of ESG that broadly, and the art of this is figuring out what E and S and G means to your organization. Again, based on your industry and so forth. There's a lot of talk / confusion around, you know, because ESG is fairly new, and there are numerous frameworks and standards out there. What framework, what standard do we follow? How, or you know, which ones do we combine, and you know, what do we do? The way I think about this, and Ben will be talking more about this when he talks about the life cycle of the journey of ESG, right? Like with any kind of risk-based program, even, you know, for those of us who are here who are seasoned ethics and compliance professionals or risk management professionals, there's a very traditional life cycle that these programs follow, right? You begin with an assessment, you then design a program to manage the risks that resulted from that assessment. You implement or operationalize what you've designed through various change management activities, and then you maintain that program through various efforts, right? The ESG journey is very similar, right? You have to understand your ESG issues at the outset. You have to get oriented around what your ESG issues are, just like ERM, and just like ethics and compliance, again, the convergence, and then design the underlying programs that manage those risks, right? So if it's environmental performance, you know, air emissions or wastewater discharge appear on your assessment at the output of your assessment, you need to design an internal compliance program that's going to manage those issues. And that's where like the ISO standard comes in and other kinds of environmental compliance standards. And you'd be doing that stuff anyway, even if we weren't talking about ESG, you're designing that underlying compliance program. And so I'll stop there for a second. Those frameworks, that ISO standard and the other related environmental frameworks are the frameworks that matter on that topic for that part of the business as you're designing out your program. Bribery and corruption turns up, you know, as one of your issues on your assessment. Then, of course, you're looking at the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the DOJ guidance that relates to it. You're looking at maybe the UK Bribery Act and what's different about that compared to the FCPA. And maybe you're also looking at ISO 37001, which lays out a management system for ABAC, right? Like that's the framework that needs to be applied on that topic within your organization. So I'm drawing a little bit of a distinction between frameworks that influence the design of your underlying compliance program with what kinds of standards you may want to report against at the end of that life cycle, right? So if it's assess, design, implement, and then validate the data that you're extracting out of your systems that you will later report, which is the final phase, you're going to want to pull that data together and report out on it in a manner that aligns with various reporting standards, right? So if there's any takeaway in this slide at all, it's not to synonymize frameworks and standards. To me, frameworks relate to how to design the underlying programs by and large, and standards, maybe I'm shorthanding this too much, but you get the idea. Standards relate more to how to report out. Okay. And the last quick thing on this slide, please, Ben, thanks for waiting, is this last bullet point, because ESG is really everything, just like, particularly for the more like progressive chief compliance officers, how ethics and compliance is everything. And you look at a company's code of conduct, table of contents. Underneath each one of those topics, there's a variety of legal and regulatory requirements domestically and internationally, right? It's a gigantic matrix of legal requirements. And all of those things have to be factored into in the underlying compliance programs that you're designing. And that's why I think it's important to think about ESG that way, that fundamentally at the baseline level, these are compliance programs. And again, like that highlights the convergence to me of ethics and compliance and ESG. There's a lot of focus, I think, on the reporting phase of ESG and what data to pull and how to pull it and how to organize it and how to present it to stakeholders. But long before that, in the life cycle, there's this sort of imperative of designing compliance programs that manage those risks. Okay, thank you, Ben. Let's go to the next slide, please. So here's an example. This is just an illustrative image that hopefully drives the point home. So if you, I know it's a lot to take in, and that's okay. We're not going to step through all of it, but if you just look at that inner wheel, the dark blue aspects of that wheel, you'll count 10 specific programmatic elements, which for ethics and compliance professionals should look pretty familiar. Having a culture of ethics and compliance is familiar to us ethics and compliance professionals, right? You need to have a culture of ESG awareness when you're talking about ESG. Having a governance and oversight function for ethics and compliance. The same is true for the ESG issues. Doing risk assessments, having a code of conduct and policies and procedures and training. All of these elements, I count 10 elements, and here at CohnReznick, we count 10. And that framework, that inner framework of 10, the dark blue stuff in that image is predicated in turn on a wide variety of external drivers, right? The federal sentencing guidelines, the DOJ guidance, various case law like in-rate Caremark, ISO standards, and on and on and on and on, come together to form that inner framework. That inner framework is the compliance program framework that manages a wide variety of risks, and you see those risks around the outside. You know, if you stripped away the outermost ribbon of environmental, social, and governance, if you took the outermost ribbon out, what you'd be looking at, what would probably look familiar to most of us, would be an ethics and compliance risk profile, right? Various environmental issues that may apply to your business, various social compliance issues that may apply to your business, and various other kinds of compliance risks, cyber, insider trading, fraud, right? If you take the outer ribbon away, a lot of those issues, if not all of them, would look familiar to us as ethics and compliance issues. So with this image, it tends to sort of drive home is we're talking about it in an ESG context, but it's really the same underlying compliance program managing those same issues, now organized into an ESG sort of format and discussed in an ESG conversation, right? I had a client once a few years back who had a point of view that said, ethics and compliance and ESG is really all of the same thing. It just depends who the audience is and who you're talking to and how they've asked the question. And I think there's some truth in that. And hopefully that this image reflects that. So that's the point on this slide. let's go to the next slide, please, Ben. And this, I think, is my final slide, intends to sort of wrap up that idea, right? At the end of the day, a risk management or an issues management framework is a risk management framework, right? Whether you are managing a risk that is thought of as an ethics and compliance risk, like let's just take bribery and corruption, right? That is, without a question, an ethics and compliance risk. It's on almost every organization's ethics and compliance risk profile. It's in their codes of conduct. It is also recognized as a social issue in the context of ESG, and it's on most organizations' enterprise risk management profile or readout or risk register under the compliance pillar of ERM, right? And so it's the same framework in all three discussions that organizations are putting in place. Again, I count 10 elements. I'm not saying it needs to be 10. This is more of a conceptual point. You know, if you're in pharmaceuticals, you may be following the OIG guidance, and that's 7 elements. The federal sentencing guidelines, depending on how you count them, count 7 or 8 elements. The ISO standards count more like 12 or 15. I've kind of rationalized all of that together and organized 10 elements. So I'm saying 10. It doesn't need to be 10, but the point I'm trying to make is that the framework itself within your organization should be leveraged. It really should be leveraged across your ethics and compliance efforts, your ESG efforts, and your ERM efforts. And so later, when you're reporting out on ESG, after all, this is an ESG conference, so the tilt here needs to be toward ESG. But there's an opportunity in almost every organization to take a look inward and sort of inventory what you're doing from a compliance perspective on those very same issues, and then report out on them through like that ESG channel, right? It's a lot of the same stuff, I guess, is what I'm trying to say here. So hopefully that helps from a table setting perspective and helping to really draw out the convergence and the heavy overlap as we see it at CohnReznick between and among ERM, ethics and compliance, and ESG. Okay, Ben, over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Maurice. So, you know, on the heels of, you know, what Maurice was saying around opportunities, you know, and understanding your risks in ESG, but also understanding where your opportunities are and knowing how to translate that into value. And there's a couple key concepts that we sort of talk about here, and that's, you know, knowing and appealing to stakeholder demands and understanding really what's accurate and relevant and should be contextualized during the reporting phase. Additionally, new and increased funding sources would be another element of ESG opportunities in which your organization could take advantage of, or an organization that is focused on implementing or growing their ESG program. You know, and lastly, you know, one important point is understanding that the changes you make today, they do carry through the organization really from end to end and do make an impact and further, you know, accelerate your organization and to grow that value. So really, you know, Maurice mentioned initially, you know, the journey of ESG, and, you know, we start with thinking about ESG at CohnReznick in the orientate fashion. So understanding really what your organization's desired ESG activities and goal settings are, and then supporting to set the roadmap for an ESG action. And then we go more to the traditional assess, design, implement, and validate and report phase. But as part of the assess, you know, it's defining and prioritizing the key issues that pertain to your organization, and then assessing the current level of ESG maturity against industry frameworks and standards, And I think that's critical in understanding where you stand and where you can grow and attain additional value. Next would be, the design phase. So developing an ESG program tailored to your organization, your objectives, your maturity, maybe the level of resources you have. So you get started with an initial program, and then as you develop that program, you can add in more. Then finally, the implementation phase, which would be, putting in those procedures, the SOPs, the controls, data governance, all across the ESG spectrum. And of course, developing the training, across your organization so that you're breeding the culture within to understand the importance of ESG. And then finally, that validation and reporting, putting out the report, increasing your brand, increasing your value, showing your stakeholders, the importance of ESG and how your organization is building and growing in that space. So again, I just want to stress that the first step of your ESG journey really is getting oriented to what ESG means to your organization. So we have several interrogatives here, and really, we want to focus on why would we want to do this for our organization, and who are our key stakeholders, and how will they play into, finding, the right ESG segments to focus on, and, then going into the assessment phase and running through that loop as I showed. And then there's, defining where the company should focus. And then, is that a geographic region? Is it or physical assets that you want to consider when building out your ESG program? And then, defining what mandates and rulings and norms. That's going back to that evolving regulatory landscape. You want to make sure that you're hitting the right elements there to make sure that you're addressing the gaps as needed. Defining how the assessments and the capabilities are critical as well, and develop remediation activities or actions should you need to close gaps. And then finally is, how long does this take? Building a roadmap to remediate, to enable the activities to really truly gain the value that you've put into your ESG program.
Yeah, I'll just jump in quickly, Ben, if that's okay. For the audience's benefit, to me, this slide, if you really kind of think about this slide and study it, it helps to highlight the intersection and the overlap of ethics and compliance with ESG, right? Like, you made the point that to get started on your ESG journey, you need to sort of start here and think about who are your, from the organizational perspective, who are your key stakeholders, right? From a community perspective, from an investor perspective, your employee base, the media, non-governmental organizations, regulators, and even competitors could be viewed as stakeholders in some ways, right? Like what's that full suite of stakeholders, and what do they care about vis-a-vis your organization? And it takes me back. I mean, I made that point earlier that this stuff's been around for decades, and I'm reminded of, even in my earliest of in-house days, long ago, when I was within the what became known as the Altria family of companies, which was the Philip Morris family of companies. Even before ERM was such a thing, we were doing issues management at the parent company level and doing extensive research to understand who were the key NGOs that were relevant from a food, tobacco, and beer business perspective, and what issues did those key NGOs care about. And I remember in those days, anti-child labor and anti-forced labor were like rose to the top of our issues list. And no surprise, right? Like those kinds of companies source agricultural products and other things from in some cases third world countries. And so child labor and forced labor became a priority issue from a CSR perspective for the Altria family of companies, and simultaneously became an ethics and compliance risk that we addressed in the code of conduct, and we had a compliance policy on that topic that we rolled out across the organization and applied all the way down and translated into numerous languages into all of the different local country markets. So that just that one example to me ties it together, and it all kind of started here with, we didn't have a slide like this at that point in time, but this slide, I think, drives that point home. Like, who are your stakeholders? What do they care about? And what are the issues ultimately that comprise your ESG issues profile? Thank you, Ben.
Yep. Fantastic. So, as we move through the journey, organizations are going to want to consider, which data measures or KPIs that they should consider. And this is just a sample set. This isn't necessarily whatever would apply to every organization, but really we can see the drill downs going from the ES and G, to look at the next level down. And the reason these are important is because you as an organization will want to identify clearly which of these elements pertain to you, and where are the best areas to focus your efforts. So, we can look at air quality and emissions, and then you can drill down into several other sub KPIs of that, or code of conduct, looking at investigations, training, and compliance, or even cybersecurity, looking at data quality. And all of these will be, once you get oriented, you can then, address which KPIs, and then you can assess, you look at your organization and say, hey, we do really well in certain areas, and we can bolster areas in others, and we want to tackle and, really develop some other element within the ES and G space. And then you'll get to the design phase, the implement phase, and then finally the report out. So then you can take the elements that you have created or have identified as your strong suits or building blocks, and put those out as a final report, whether that's a sustainability report, annual report, on your website. And finally, each of these metrics can have both qualitative and quantitative aspects, helping your organization to really identify the risks and complexity in addressing them. And, that's something that can be a challenge for many organizations, but adds a lot of value when it comes to benchmarking against, competitors, for example, or even just putting out, what your stakeholders will find value in. So, again, this is just, as I noted in the previous slides, the outputs and metrics really do result in qualitative and quantitative analysis, and will drive those types of reports. And so the strategy and goals are based on your stakeholder expectations. You'll want to consider materiality, industry benchmarks, as I noted, and process controls for validating. And process and controls should be in place, pre-reporting, to ensure that all the data that's been reported out is relevant and reliable.
So in terms of key takeaways, and just to kind of track back to some of the highlights from the presentation, at the outset, organizations should not think of ESG as a singular risk or issue, right? But as an umbrella term that kind of transcends and overarches a variety of environmental issues, social issues, governance issues that apply to each company based on industry, based on geographic footprint, based on operating model, industry trends, regulatory trends, enforcement trends, stakeholder trending issues. There's a lot that goes into that, figuring out what your ESG issues profile should look like. But I think it's just important to not think of ESG as a singular issue or a bullet point on a heat map. I had a client some years ago, maybe like 3 or 4 years ago, that had put ESG on an enterprise risk management heat map as an issue or as a risk. And we talked it through, and I'm hopefully, as you're gathering from this session, when you unpack ESG and when you unpack ERM and when you unpack your ethics and compliance risk profile, it's really all of the same, or at least most of the same issues, right? It's like, what discussion are we having, and who's the audience, and how do we want to present what we're doing to key stakeholders on those very same issues, right? Again, for a manufacturing company, wastewater discharge or air emissions is going to be an ESG issue, an ethics and compliance issue, and an ERM risk. The second big takeaway is that hopefully also, as we've pointed out, and hope you agree, that the underlying compliance program and the design of those frameworks that help organizations prevent and detect and respond to legal and regulatory violations or other kinds of misconduct are the same frameworks that should be in place to manage E and S and G risks or issues, right? These are one and the same compliance programs fundamentally that underpin these ESG efforts and initiatives long before you get to the reporting phase, just in terms of the operations. Third big takeaway, which is really in some ways the title of this entire program, to take an integrated approach. And this is something that we help our clients with, right? To the extent organizations have a standalone ERM initiative or exercise, and a different kind of standalone, but maybe lightly related ethics and compliance program, and yet still a third, maybe somewhat new or nascent ESG program, there's a real opportunity to leverage all of those resources and leverage the subject matter expertise and the competencies within the organization and pull that all together and maximize performance at the same time, and drive down and drive out duplicative costs or unnecessary expenses that result from taking a three-way kind of siloed approach and begin to push this stuff together, because really fundamentally at bottom, these are one and the same programs that we're talking about. So those are three key takeaways, and Ben will step you through the remaining four.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Maurice. And, I can't stress enough, first mover advantage here, and really early adopters of ESG practices will outpace their competitors, and, that will set them, ahead and gain, advantages in the marketplace. I know that, as Maurice has said, a lot of organizations have been doing ESG, but not necessarily branded as that. I think as organizations start to look more and deeply into the ESG KPIs that I discussed, I think that, they'll start to see more and more value coming out of those deep dive issues. Additionally, organizations who cultivate their ESG programs and develop a mature program will realize value and capitalize on those opportunities, rather than spending time or money or value, remediating risks. And investors and customers and stakeholders currently expect a certain level of transparency from organizations. And I think as time moves on, that level of transparency is growing. So the demand for additional transparency is starting to take shape. And then finally, closing the gap on ESG compliance presents a significant challenge for organizations that don't already implement essential ESG standards currently. This is key, and I think that if those gaps are become narrowed, there will be much more value in your organization, as well as value going to your stakeholders. And Maurice, back over to you.
Yeah, terrific. So we're right on time here. We've got maybe 9 minutes left. I did a quick scroll through the questions that came in. I'll go back to the very first one that caught my eye and which I spoke to. Again, I think we should recognize that organizing an organization's E and S and G issues profile is somewhat of an art, just like it is with ERM and ethics and compliance risk assessments, right? There's always collaborative discussion internally in a number of ways, right? Like what sub-risks or issues should be consolidated into something a little broader for ease of reading, for simplicity of managing risks, particularly if it's the same risk owner. The idea of consolidating these issues is one of those examples. Another is, where to list certain risks, right? Even in the ERM context, there are risks that could fall into the operational pillar or could also fall into the ethics and compliance pillar. I mean, if you think about ERM as having 4 pillars: strategic, financial, operational, and something called ethics and compliance. You've got risks that could be slotted in various pillars. I don't worry as much about where to slot those risks to a degree, as much as I do making sure that the key risks are captured. I think from an ESG perspective, topics like data governance or cybersecurity or fraud, bribery, corruption could be discussed, whether they belong from an organizational point of view, whether the organization and the board and the executive team see those things as part of the fundamental fabric of the organization's governance structure and how it operates, or do they see it, some of those issues, the way certain key stakeholders like NGOs might see it, as a societal issue, right? Data privacy through the eyes of many NGOs is a societal imperative and should be thought of as a social issue. That could go either way, I think, and I would just say the priority really ought to be making sure that the key issues are on that list somewhere, and then figure out where it makes the most sense to place those issues from an issues owner or risk owner perspective within the organization. Happy to go offline and talk more deeply about that, as with any of these questions or anything that we've covered today. So don't hesitate to reach out to me if you'd like to. Another question I saw, and I'm going to skip over one or two to get to this one, and then I'm going to go backwards and ask Ben to speak to the other two. One question that came in had something to do with the idea: is it important to document the what I'll call drivers on which your ESG program is predicated or designed? So, like the federal sentencing guidelines, the Department of Justice guidance, the various ISO standards. I think from an ethics and compliance perspective, it's already a recognized practice to have a document of some kind that explains how your compliance program was designed and what it was based on and what it's composed of. So, picture a very traditional Word document maybe that has a vision statement for your ethics and compliance function and a mission statement that explains the role that the ethics and compliance function pursues within the organization, and then a section that might explain the 7 or 8 or 10 elements of your compliance program, and then maybe a section that explains what those 7, 8, or 10 elements is based on, And it would be like in that section, in my mind, where you would list out at least the key, again, I'm using the word drivers, right? The federal sentencing guidelines, DOJ guidance, OIG guidance to the extent that it's relevant, various ISO standards, case law, other kinds of evaluative criteria, and kind of capture all of that in what I would think of as like a compliance program summary document. This is not a document that would be employee facing like a code of conduct would be. This is more of a document that might go into a file, and if you've ever needed to produce it to explain how you designed your compliance program, you would have that. And that same document could be relevant in an ESG context if certain stakeholders are asking just to learn more about how you've designed, say, your environmental compliance program or the underlying DE&I program. Again, the flip side of DEI in my mind is the company's anti-discrimination, anti-harassment compliance program. Ben, we've got 3 minutes. One question that came in had to do with the remote and hybrid work environment that we're now in. I guess this virtual conference is a good example of that. And what impact from an environmental reporting perspective and environmental compliance perspective this new remote environment has.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Maurice. So I think that there would certainly be implications there in terms of your carbon footprint, the amount of miles traveled. And so, you definitely could measure that, and you could definitely figure out, what your reduction might have been in terms of just, not commuting to the office or not flying out. As consultants, I think, Maurice, in 2019, you and I probably spent 100,000 miles in the air. Now that's been significantly reduced because of this new environment that we find ourselves in. So I think that there, are great advantages to, from an E perspective, and maybe even an S and G, from a cultural standpoint, where, now you have, you're working from home. But I think that, there's definitely significant implications environmentally with respect to this hybrid model we've now taken.
Got time for one more question. I'm going to hand it back to Alyssa. It's 11:28 East Coast time. A question that just came in is around. It's sort of like, I guess, there's a question around the skepticism around ESG, and is ESG, to the extent a company is pursuing ESG objectives, is it really to make a difference from a social issues perspective or an environmental issues perspective, or is it really just about regulatory compliance? And I think the way we've tried to step through this today is to demonstrate that the price of admission for conducting business is to be in compliance with all applicable laws, including environmental laws and various kinds of labor and employment laws and EEOC laws. So that to me is like the baseline. If you were to like draw out like a diagram of this, like that, you have to be doing those things regardless of how you decide to, care for ESG. So with that said, there's absolutely a trend. We're seeing it in private equity and in some other industries where organizations are seen to have greater value if they are doing ESG well, and they've got ESG programs and they've got data and they're reporting out on it. We see it particularly in private equity from an investment perspective. The organizations who are doing ESG well are perceived to have greater value from an investment perspective. So there's real teeth in this, and it's just going to get it's just going to move more and more in that direction. Alyssa, we're right on time. I just want to say thanks to the audience for the opportunity, and to the ECI. As always, it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm always happy to connect over email with audience members and follow up with anything else.